Hey, thought you could leave without saying goodbye.
The death of Fast and Furious star Paul Walker.
The actor had been attending his charity event to benefit typhoon victims in the Philippines.
On December 1st, 2013, a user by the name of Unknown1 would make a post to the popular truth forum Godlike Productions, detailing what he believed to be the real reason for Paul Walker and Roger Rodas' fatal collision. The post reads as follows.
Paul Walker and his friend were killed shortly after they discovered a conspiracy to supply victims of Typhoon Haiyan with a prototype permanent birth control drug hidden in medical supplies and food aid. They had a damning recording, and they were on their way to rendezvous with an ally who would have helped them get in touch with the right people. Turns out they were betrayed, and someone rigged their car's brakes to malfunction after a certain speed. Now that the loose end has been tied up and the recording destroyed, the people responsible have nothing to fear, as this will become another conspiracy theory no one will take seriously.
Immediately after OP finished his post, he would disappear, not responding to a single comment. I found this really odd, so I decided to search for his account, with no success. Godlike Productions keeps a record of every account and allows you to search for the username along with all variants. Searching for the account by the same name, there were no matches going back 11 years to the earliest record of any account, including the name unknown. It's almost like he never existed, but we know he did, at least for a brief instant. So for the sake of Paul Walker and Roger Rodas, and also quite possibly OP, let's dive into the dark truth that is the murder of Paul Walker and Roger Rodas. OP begins his post by saying that
Paul Walker and his friend were killed shortly after they discovered a conspiracy to supply victims of Typhoon Haiyan with a prototype permanent birth control drug hidden in medical supplies and food aid.
Which is something Paul and Roger could possibly have known, since in 2010, Walker and Roger partnered to create Reach Out Worldwide, a nonprofit that brings first responders and aid to disaster areas. And in November 2013, just days before their murder, their organization Reach Out Worldwide would travel to the Philippines to help bring aid and first responders to areas affected by Typhoon Haiyan. For context, the Philippines gives new meaning to the word poor, with roughly 20% or 20 million people living below the poverty line. This is in part due to its location, where it's exposed to more natural disasters than anywhere else in the world, along with a corrupt government and a pandemic that push millions more into poverty. This makes them vulnerable to outside predation, since the Philippines can't afford to deny any aid they are offered and can't afford to test everything, or really anything, that comes over their borders, which has actually been a problem before. In November of 1996, an article was released by the Interim discussing the chemical HCG and tetanus shots sent to the Philippines to supposedly help with neonatal tetanus. The HCG was uncovered by local Catholic officials who became suspicious of the aid and decided to have it sent to private laboratories. 9 of the 47 vials tested contained HCG. For context, HCG is a powerful sterilizing agent that would never, under literally any circumstances, be anywhere near a tetanus shot. So finding it in 1 vial is absurd, but 9? That can only mean it was done intentionally. The tetanus vaccine campaign was conducted on roughly 4 million Filipino women, most of whom were fertile and of breeding age, which with 9 of the 47 vials containing the sterilizing agent, that means that almost 20% of the 4 million women were sterilized against their will and knowledge. That's a total of more than 760,000 women, and those are just the ones we know of. A former insider within the population control movement discusses how the World Health Organization will pressure weak countries like the Philippines to take their tainted vaccines. The fact that Filipino women were sterilized in secret is horrifying to say the least. However, it's even scarier that this is not an isolated incident. In another article published by LifeSite, the Kenyan Catholic Doctors Association uncovered HCG in the tetanus vaccines they had received from the United Nations and the WHO. In this case, the vaccine had been applied to more than 2.3 million women. The Kenyan Catholic Doctors Association was able to acquire 6 vials of the shots. After sending them to private laboratories in South Africa, they all came back positive for HCG. HCG is something that literally has no business being anywhere near a tetanus shot, and yet it was found in every single vial. The KCDA brought these findings to the Kenyan Ministry of Health, but were ignored, with officials stating that the vaccine is completely safe. Unsurprisingly, these articles were buried, and I'm fairly certain we're the only ones who have seen them in years. The fact that millions of women were unknowingly sterilized and it was never talked about really makes me wonder how many times this has happened, and if it's happening right now, but we'll have to save that for another video. But now we know that secret sterilization campaigns have actually been carried out in the past, and we also know that Paul and Roger's team were working in unison with the WHO and the UN, who were also in the Philippines at the time giving aid and medicine. All of which is to say that it is highly probable that another sterilization plan was in play and that someone involved may have reached out to Paul and his organization. If what OP claims is true and they did have an incriminating recording, why would the confidant go to Paul and Roger? It's because they had a huge platform. Paul at this point was a film icon. He was beloved by tens of millions of adoring fans who would have taken him seriously if he had brought something like this to the mainstream. Additionally, Roger was a highly connected financial advisor for Merrill Lynch. In fact, the 3 years before he was murdered, 2010, 2011, and 2012, he was ranked in the top 1,000 advisors in America, working with some of the wealthiest clients in the world, thus fitting with OP's claim
Way to rendezvous with an ally who would have helped them get in touch with the right people.
Therefore, it's true that there really was no one better than these two for getting the info out and potentially having access to the right people.
Turns out they were betrayed, and someone rigged their car's brakes to malfunction after a certain speed.
And this is where things get really interesting. Of all OP's claims, this has the most evidence. For everyone watching, here's a refresher in skid marks. A skid mark is a rubber trail left on asphalt, and it looks like two tire-shaped black lines following the path the vehicle took. Skid marks are left behind when a car suddenly begins braking. The longer the skid mark, the higher the rate of speed when the person pressed the brakes. If you have driven a car, you've likely been in a scenario where you had to slam on the brakes. And those few seconds between when you slam on them and when you stop are critical, and they can honestly be the difference between life and death. The more time one gives themselves to stop, the better chance they have to survive, making the slamming of brakes a basic human instinct. But apparently not for two race car drivers, because at the crash site, there were literally no skid marks, no sign at all of the brakes having been pressed until the very last few feet before Roger and Paul collided with the lamppost. Meaning that Roger, an extremely experienced race car driver, never bothered to hit the brakes to save their lives until the moment before the collision. And Paul, another extremely experienced race car driver, never bothered to tell Roger to press them. When police investigate a car crash, one of the first things they look for are skid marks. When there aren't any, then it's an obvious sign of foul play, especially when the crash involves two powerful men who also happen to be race car drivers in a $500,000 supercar. They don't just forget to try the brakes, and brakes don't simply stop working. Obviously, the investigation ignored this fun fact, so let's do a little digging for ourselves. Clearly, cutting brake lines in this scenario wouldn't work for a number of reasons. Firstly, the car was taken to Paul and Roger's charity event, meaning the brakes had been working. Additionally, cutting the brake lines or tampering with the car in any way would have quickly been noticed by the two experienced drivers. Thus, a more devious and undetectable method would be required. More specifically, something that is completely untraceable and almost entirely unknown to the public. A tiny reference which was hidden in one of WikiLeaks' most infamous dumps. Vault 7 is one of WikiLeaks' greatest gifts to humanity. It revealed much about the extent to which the feds are monitoring the globe. The dump included thousands of pages detailing the CIA's ability to trace leaked documents, watch you through your phone, download remote video streams, monitor keystrokes so encryption breaking is unnecessary, and, oh yeah, you know, shut down or completely take over control of your car from anywhere on Earth. OP's claim that someone rigged their car's brakes to malfunction after a certain speed doesn't seem so far-fetched. In fact, it sounds incredibly plausible. Considering everything Paul and Roger knew or were potentially privy to, big government organizations would stop at nothing to put an end to them and any potential allegations. After all, the CIA and other terrorist organizations have no qualms about killing. Sadly though, the evidence for murders like these are slim to none, and if any does exist, it's buried in CIA archives. But fortunately, for you and me on the side of the truth, there is a trail of murders like Paul and Roger's that serve as evidence for one another and for the evil that surrounds us. And Paul and Roger's murder is just the first of a number that I will cover on this channel. For now though, we must focus our attention on the guilty parties we can actually reach. And these are the people who capitalized on Paul and Roger's deaths. Sadly for Paul, the list is long and includes most of his family and friends. First are Paul's brothers, who received a fat paycheck and their 15 minutes of fame for parading in Paul's CGI carcass to finish the Fast 7 movie. If you haven't seen what I'm referring to, it's on screen now, and it's some of the most vile Hollywood greed I've ever seen. The greed continues though to Universal Studios itself, who began litigation with their insurance agent shortly after Paul's death, with Universal claiming that they were owed $50 million because Paul's death delayed the film's release. As it relates to Paul's fellow cast members, I'm sure you can imagine the fake tears and sob stories that were displayed for every possible camera. However, the cake has to go to Tyrese, who fakes a meltdown at the sight of Paul's car from the Fast franchise, but not before making certain that every camera within a 10-mile radius is pointed at him. I won't even lie, at one point I'm pretty sure he looks up at the cameras to make sure they're recording him. But the most heinous act of all was done by Meadow Walker, Paul's greedy, contemptuous daughter, who sued Roger Rodas' family and won a $10 million settlement with his estate. This actually makes me sick. Suing your dead dad's best friend for millions of dollars when they died in the same car crash is downright disgraceful, and she should be utterly ashamed of herself. This act is even more disgraceful because it's not as though she was left penniless by her late father. In fact, Paul left his daughter $25 million, but apparently that wasn't enough, so she went and robbed a dead man's family. And the cherry on top of this shameful Sunday, it's that Paul's Instagram is not only still active and posting pictures of him, it also sells merch with his face on it. Now that I've gone on this massive rant, where does this leave us? Well, exactly where OP said we would be. The murder is now 10 years old to the minute of upload, and the evidence that would incriminate the guilty parties has long since been destroyed. So except for the relative few of us who understand what actually happened that day, OP is right, and
now that the loose end has been tied up and the recording destroyed, the people responsible have nothing to fear, as this will become another conspiracy theory no one will take seriously.
So unfortunately, that's where I leave you until next time. And remember, every time you set foot in your car, the government can and will kill you if they desire, and best of all, they'll call it an accident.